Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I wanted to talk about something a little bit different. I don't usually stray too deeply into strong critique of storytelling on this channel, mainly because I feel I do it better in prose than I do speaking extemporaneously like this. Now, I do the indie comic reviews, which cover a bunch of things other than story, but I think I look the most at story in the typical review. I do that as much for a community service to give feedback to new writers, which most of these indie comic writers are, on their work so they can think of ways to improve it and stuff like that. But I don't think digging into really complicated ideas about storytelling is my forte in this kind of extemporaneous speaking. And I can, write a pretty detailed essay on it and flesh out all my ideas. I could record that. But honestly, there are people who do it better on YouTube. So I largely just leave it on my blog, which is honestly where all the people who want to hear from me are probably going to find that kind of thing anyways. I mean, if you do want to hear me record one of these kind of essays, by all means, drop a line down below and let me know. But I wanted to talk about something specific here, which I think is of use to any writer who is trying to unpack the very, very broad and very complex commentary on fiction, whether it be in movies and TV or in books, et cetera, and try and make sense of that. And one of the things you will notice in a lot of commentary is a kind of a dislike for archetypes. Not so much a dislike as in a strong desire to avoid even talking about them and how they inform a work, which makes sense. This video is entitled Why Critics Hate Archetypes, but they don't really hate them. And maybe that was a bit clickbaity of me, but the point is, critics, the best critics certainly, but even many of the mediocre critics are looking at a work in and of itself. They want to really break down a single story and analyze what that means, what it works about it, what doesn't work about it. And they will bring a lot of their own biases to the table, but they also try and eliminate those biases to a certain extent. If they don't eliminate them, they at least broadcast them to you very loudly, intentionally or not. Now, when we look at something like an archetype, that is something external to the story, to the text, as we might say. An archetype is a broad notion of a kind of person or a kind of story that our culture has become familiar with. The most famous archetype is, of course, the hero with 1,000 faces that we all know inspired George Lucas and was discussed in a book by that title by Joseph Campbell. But archetypes come in a lot of forms outside of that. It can be something as simple as the older brother archetype or the younger sister archetype or the little brother archetype or the caring father archetype or the careless father archetype. You can probably think of somebody who fits in any of those archetypes very quickly, whether you think of Andy Griffith, if you're an old timer, or if you think of Homer Simpson, if you are a bit younger. There are a lot of examples of these archetypes. The problem is, from a critical perspective, there's not a lot to be gained by talking about an archetype. The very breadth of scope in an archetype, the number of times the story of a hero with 1,000 faces has been told, makes it very difficult to say anything specific about it. It's a very broad group, nonetheless a useful group, but a very broad one that is almost impossible to discuss in specifics. Now, you can look at a story through the lens of that archetype. There is such a thing as criticism that attempts to analyze a story through a preset series of notions. And it's pretty popular today. That's what racial critical theory is. That's what women's theory is. There are a lot of schools of thought that do it. The problem is, looking at a story from that perspective really warps the story, or at least it warps our perception of the story. And when you take an archetype as your way of looking at a story, you tend to really narrow down your focus to one character. That's a really difficult way to analyze longer stories. Now, short stories tend to only have 1, 2, or maybe 3 characters in them. So maybe you can analyze a short story entirely through the lens of archetype. But you can't really do even a half-hour episode of a TV show that way. There are too many characters in play. And while many of those characters may be archetypes, watch a sitcom from the 90s for a classic example of a cast that is all archetypes. These longer stories require these two archetypes to bounce off each other, and so you can't really do the kind of criticism where you only look at one archetype. You have to start relating them to each other and talking about those relations in order to make good critique. This prompts a lot of critics to say, well, we can simply ignore archetypes and look at the specifics. And I think for most criticism, that's true. The specifics of the way the archetypes are employed are far more important than the broad strokes of the archetype, and you can just talk about those. However, I think there's another element of it as well. Because archetypes are so broad, everyone brings a slightly different understanding of them to the table. And there is a strong desire in the minds of critics, or at least some critics, to remove that personal perspective from the analysis, to really just look at the text and try and unpack what it's saying. They might be interested in the perspective of the creator, but they are not trying to confine the creator's vision with their own. There are some critics who do that. I don't really recommend following their criticism. I do believe it is a good idea to try and remove that individual perspective from a piece of criticism, but it does tend to undermine an understanding of what the broad audience reaction is. And many storytellers, and in fact, I would say most storytellers, don't put a lot of thought into audience reaction because audiences are bringing their own preconceived notions, their own takes on archetypes, and etc. to the table. However, I think you can't really tell a story without an audience. So guild creators do need to be thinking about that kind of response to the archetypes that are in their story. They do need to be keeping their finger on the pulse of the way archetypes are being used. They do need to be thinking really hard about the way their audience is going to hear the archetypical language, read their archetypical characters, and how they're going to interact with each other so they can tell a story that will get the reaction they want from their audience. This doesn't mean the audience is dictating to creators. It means in order to explain a story to someone, you have to speak their language. I cannot tell a story to a person who speaks only Russian in this format. Perhaps if they could see my face and my hands, I might be able to make myself understood a little bit. But ultimately, to really explain something to someone, we have to share a language. And whether we like it or not, archetypes are part of the storytelling language. And again, I think it's fine for critics to ignore them as they do their analysis of a specific piece of work. Unless there is some kind of specific call out in one piece of work to another piece of work that falls along these archetypical lines, they really don't need to examine these elements too deeply. The specifics are far more important, and archetypes only give you the broad strokes. But a storyteller needs to think about archetypes and how the story they are telling is going to run into them, or else their message is going to be distorted by the common understanding of archetypes in the world around them. This is an aspect of prose which I talked about not too long ago in another video, where you need to try and use words in the way they are commonly in use, as opposed to the way you wish they were used or the way they might have been used in the past or other elements like this. Archetypes are part of the prose of storytelling. And if you want to be a good storyteller, be on your toes with them. Again, I think it's fine that critics don't pay a lot of attention to archetype. There's a lot of good reasons for the critic to do that. However, if you are a creator and you are trying to hone your craft and you are paying a lot of attention to critics, you're going to get this element downplayed to you. And I think that is ultimately going to harm your storytelling to a certain extent. It is fine to watch and listen to critics to try and get a sense of what the failings and the strengths of a genre or an industry or a societal level storytelling is. Critics get where they are because they're very good at breaking that down for you. However, they are never going to give you a full picture because they are really typically only concerned with one piece at a time. If you want to be a good storyteller, yes, it is important to drill down and look at those very narrow details, but it's also important to take a step back and look at the broad picture and remember that you are going to be adding to that broad and very rich picture with your own work. You have to be ready to do that just as much as you have to be ready to drill down to those details. Anyway, that's what I got for you today. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, there's a like button and subscribe button down below. You can use as you see fit. Let me know what your favorite archetype is in the comments down below, and I will talk to you later.